and have dramatic effects on later arcs. And where those seeds start to poke through the surface is in the next major arc, Hueco Mundo. After a few skirmishes with the Arrancar, Aizen's army of massively powerful hollow people and totally not furries, I swear to god they're not furries, the Hueco Mundo arc begins, and immediately we kind of have that same problem with world building. This place is basically hell, or at least a bad afterlife, and think of all the crazy ways that's been portrayed in media, but instead of that, we kind of just get a giant empty desert, and it's like, cool. At this point, it's still not that big an issue, but the much bigger problem with Hueco Mundo is it's kind of just Soul Society again. And I was a little general with this criticism last time around, so allow me to be more specific. Ichigo and his friends invade a land of extremely powerful death gods who are all part of a hierarchical organization in order to rescue.
Y mañana la gente cobra. Cuidado. Mañana la gente cobra.
Their female friend who has been imprisoned for semi-mysterious reasons. They immediately encounter a large enemy who they defeat with an overwhelming display of force before being split up and fighting their own individual battles. Uryu fights a mad scientist who sacrifices his own minions. Chad is depicted as one of the most powerful members of the group before being squashed by an even more powerful enemy to demonstrate the danger of the opposing force. One of Ichigo's allies is a cute side character who eventually transforms into a sexy, powerful, fully grown woman who used to be part of the opposing force before switching sides. Former enemies of Ichigo show up to help in the final stages of the battle, and Ichigo fights first a low-ranking enemy, then a wild middle-ranking enemy with a bestial fighting style, and finally, in order to save the girl, a massively powerful, stoic and cold high-ranking member of the enemy force who previously defeated him. And during this battle, he loses control of his hollow side, goes berserk before finally regaining control and saving the day, before Aizen reveals that the kidnapping of the girl is only the small part of a much larger plan. This is not general structural repetition, these are the same story beats, and it's maybe the first indication that Bleach is struggling a little with its long-term direction. But worse, by being so similar to Soul Society, it shows you exactly what's missing from Hueco Mundo, and particularly in the Arrancar. The problem with the Arrancar is that they're never given the time to develop as characters the same way the Soul Reapers were. I can tell you every captain, vice captain, and even some of the seated chairs of the 13 Corps Guard. I can tell you about their backstories, their relationships, their motives, even the really unimportant little side people, because the series spent the time to tell you who these people were. Now, with that in mind, if you've seen Bleach, can you tell me anything about any of the characters on screen right now? Their relationships, their goals? How about this guy or this girl? Or was this guy really in it? I watched this like 2 weeks ago. Is this actually a character? Oh, yeah, no, it is. That okay. This isn't to say there isn't any characterization, there is some, and what flashes we do get of the Arrancar are really interesting. Noitra pointing out the hypocrisy of the Soul Reapers, Ulquiorra slowly developing a bond with Orihime, and Barragan hurling his axe at Aizen in one final act of defiance. These moments are great, but they're so brief, feeling more like supplemental information rather than being the motives driving the characters' actions. With most of the Arrancar, even some of the really important ones like Halle Bell, given little to no development at all. And it doesn't just make for less compelling characters, but critically has a dramatic effect on how Bleach's fights work. When I talk about fight scenes, I like to break them down into two narratives: emotional narratives and technical narratives. And to help explain this a little, think of a showdown from an anime
Una de las mejores peleas de la historia del anime.
As a game of chess. The emotional narrative is the story that's brought the two opposing players to play this game of chess. Their backstories, their journeys, their relationships, and what victory or defeat means to either one. In other words, the emotional narrative is everything that happens off the chessboard, while the technical narrative is everything that happens on the chessboard, the physical story that unfolds through each character's actions, the logical progression of moves and counter moves that leads to one character checkmating another. To break this down in terms of an actual battle, let's take Frieza versus Goku. The emotional narrative here would be that Frieza is a horrible space racist who validates his own existence by inflicting pain and misery on anyone he deems weaker than he is. Goku being a member of one of those supposedly inferior races, whose people have been genocided by Frieza, now fighting to prove that Frieza's power does not justify his actions. As for the technical narrative, I won't go through it all.
Lo que me gusta de estos youtubers gringos que estamos viendo es que no fuerzan su voz, ¿entendés? Onda, te habla como seguramente debe hablar en su casa, y eso me gusta. Y eso me gusta. Y también edita como un hijo de puta. Un fenómeno. Un fenómeno.
Because it's a really long fight, but the final stages of this battle are the famous moment where Goku goes Super Saiyan, which lets him finally fight on even footing with Frieza, Frieza in turn growing more desperate, leading to him using his rather dangerous energy discs, the fight ending with Frieza's own attacks being turned against him. This is the logical progression of actions, the technical narrative that brings the fight to a close. As long as a fight scene has a strong emotional or technical narrative, it's probably going to be pretty entertaining, with great ones incorporating both. But I would say the strength of the battles in Soul Society were in their emotional narratives, and you can see that in the battle with Renji. Look at the amount of storytelling that went into establishing who he is, why he was fighting, and how the outcome of that fight changed his future actions in that story. And the problem with the battles of Hueco Mundo is there is so much less character development. It means the battles lack that emotional storytelling that was so critical in Soul Society. And I'd even say that of the really big fights, like Ichigo versus Grimmjow. Now, I like Grimmjow, I like his swagger, I would let him buy me a drink, but my problem with his showdown with Ichigo is it lacks any kind of personal or emotional narrative that drives the conflict. We get a little backstory about how Grimmjow ate his old Hollow partners, which does set up a nice contrast with how he and Ichigo view relationships, but it doesn't escalate the personal conflict between Ichigo and Grimmjow in any meaningful way. And once Grimmjow is defeated, he just disappears from the story as if his only real purpose was as an obstacle for Ichigo to overcome. Yes, I know he shows up for a cameo 300 chapters later, it doesn't matter. And compare that to the emotional narrative of Renji and Ichigo, and it's so much less substantial. I use the fight with Grimmjow as an example because it's actually one of the better encounters in Hueco Mundo, but the reality is that the vast majority of battles are way worse. Most feel like they exist in isolation, devoid of any meaningful personal narrative or the sense that they're part of a larger story. And this leads to a second problem with Bleach's fights. And that is, when you take the emotional narrative out of them, it exposes how simple and repetitive the technical narratives of Bleach's battles are. To show you what I mean here, let's take Uryu and let's look at how he wins his first 4 fights. He wins his battle with Jirobo by unveiling his brand new weapon, the Sanrei Glove. He wins his battle with Mairu by unveiling his brand new modification, the Let's Still. He wins his fight with Werner by unveiling his brand new weapon, the Ginrei Kojaku. And he wins his fight with Sander Wiki by unveiling his brand new weapon, the Seile Shinder. I'm not criticizing any of these fights.
Tac, 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 tac. Oye, tenemos que ganar, tranquilo. Tac, 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 tac. Hijo de puta.
Fights individually, but you can start to see a pattern here. Each one of Uryu's fights ends with him introducing a brand new element the audience has no prior knowledge of, and it's that new element that solves the conflict. In stage writing, this is known as Deus Ex Machina, an unexpected power or event saving a seemingly hopeless situation. But this is shonen, so I'm gonna call it the Star Finger problem. Star Finger is an ability from Stardust Crusaders when, in order to get Jotaro out of danger, Star Platinum is given the rather strange ability of extending his fingers and just stabbing people from far away. The issue I have with this is that Jotaro's Star Platinum is a short-range, high-damage stand, meaning Jotaro's problem he must overcome in his battles is how to close the distance between his opponents and deliver as much damage as possible. And to do this, he'll need to carefully observe and understand the abilities of his opponent and exploit the weaknesses of those abilities while they try and do the same to him. This is the kind of psychological, tactical battle that would come to define JoJo, and how a series that is 95% male models shooting ghosts at each other can stay so compelling, because it leads the viewer on this wild ride of moves, counter moves, and counters to those counters, thereby creating a strong technical narrative that leads the viewer through fights. The problem with Starfinger is it allows Jotaro to cheat the short-range limitations of Star Platinum, bypassing the entire narrative of the fight, robbing the audience of that story. And Bleach is full of Starfingers. Now, granted, it is not the only shonen series guilty of this, but it does do it a lot. For example, Kenpachi defeats Noitara by unveiling his brand new double-handed technique. Chad beats his first major enemy by growing a brand new demon arm, and his second by growing a second brand new demon arm. Yorichi defeats Siphon by unveiling her brand new Shunko, Rukia defeats D-Roy by unveiling her Shikai, Yumichika defeats Charlotte by revealing his Shikai, Hisagi defeats Findor by unveiling his Shikai, Toshiro survives Halle Bell by unveiling his Bankai, Akaku defeats this guy by unveiling his Bankai. Do you see what I am saying? Well, tough, we're not done. Later on in the manga, our heroes are being attacked by an enemy who uses the ability God's Light, and Nana reveals her Shikai, which just so happens to be Reflect God's Light. And there's even an entire sub-arc where, just as all hope is lost, the Soul Reapers have a final hour reveal where it turns out they were all under a self-imposed power limitation, which once released lets them Deus Ex Machina their way to victory. I could keep going, but the point is that each encounter ends with something the audience has no prior knowledge of solving the conflict, bypassing the technical narrative, meaning the strategy or psychology of these fights don't matter, because inevitably there will always be a final hour unexpected power or event that will save the seemingly hopeless situation. And there are actual instances of characters using real strategy in Bleach, like Ushoda trapping Baragon in a barrier so he can't avoid Soifon's Bankai, and moments like this are the hypest of the entire series, but they are few and far between. Far more common being what we just talked about, and unfortunately, the worst example of this is Ichigo himself. The way Ichigo wins fights is universally through a massive surge of power he uses to overwhelm his opponents. This is how he beats Ikkaku, Renji, Kenpachi, Byakuya, Grimmjow, Ulquiorra, and it carries all the problems we just talked about, but because Ichigo is our protagonist, several more. A huge part of the appeal of shonen protagonists is watching them gradually get better at something, watching their fighting style evolve in fun and creative ways, those new ways of fighting allowing them to climb to even greater heights within their world. In Hajime no Ippo, for example, we watch Ippo go from knowing absolutely nothing about boxing to gradually learning jabs, uppercuts, defense, and footwork, and then when he finally combines everything he's learned into the Dempsey roll finishing technique, it's one of the most exciting moments in shonen because we've been there with him since the very beginning. This devastating move, the sum total of his entire journey, and it's beautiful. Likewise, think of all the crazy inventive attacks Luffy learns to do with his rubber body, or the wild shit Naruto pulls off with his shadow clones. These moments don't just look cool, they are the physical embodiment that our protagonists have grown and evolved, and that is the core of shonen. But Ichigo doesn't really work like this. His power surges are generally justified through brief and often really abstract feeling training sequences that feel disconnected from how Ichigo actually fights. When I first saw Hollow Ichigo use his sword like a chain and sickle projectile weapon, I thought that was going to open up a really cool new fighting style for Ichigo. But that never happens. Instead, the show just has these points where it tells us that Ichigo is now stronger or faster or some ambiguous combination of the two. He gets new swords and outfits, but after his Bankai reveal in Soul Society, there's never a feeling that the way he fights or the moves he uses is evolving in a meaningful way, which means that his fights just keep ending in these same big surges of power. But Eye Patch Wolf, you handsome devil, I hear the comment section cry, Goku and Frieza also ends in a giant power surge. And look, that's a fair point, but the difference is that Goku going Super Saiyan doesn't end the fight. It's just one part in a logical progression that leads to Frieza being sliced in half by his own energy disc. Goku does get a big surge of power, but he still has to use it creatively to beat Frieza, ending the fight in this little moment of storytelling where Frieza's undoing is his own anger and hatred being turned against him. And it's that level of storytelling that's missing from Ichigo's victories, because it's all